Europa, gefühlsecht. Die vierte Macht. A very warm welcome to Europa gefühlsecht, die vierte Macht. In this series we talk about Europe's factual and emotional sides and the power of the media as the fourth estate. This series addresses especially the power of communication and the responsibility of communicators who create a conclusive picture of the world within our minds in the best case. Such communicators traditionally are found in media and of course in the field of education. Schools and universities play a crucial role in the building of a society. They transport a common yet differentiated picture of our world. They build up mutual basics for living together peacefully, and they teach and reinforce a scientific approach to what is happening all around of us and within us as individuals and society. Especially in these difficult times, we need reliable ways and methods when it comes to deal with challenges, with decision-making, and most of all, when it comes to define the common ground of what is true and what is imagination. No matter how much some ideas are fed by fears or hopes, we still have to unmask them and to make them, to make the difference between facts and opinions very clear. And just as the free media and journalists have had hard times these days fighting against, for example, fake news, disinformation or anti-democratic campaigning, also universities can find themselves in the crossfire between political calculations, informational manipulation and blunt conspiracy theories. The CEU, Central European University, was originally located in Budapest, Hungary, but had to endure a very tough time there. It has been confronted with numerous accusations by the government, especially while Viktor Orban ran for elections, trying to win conservative votes by massively arguing against, e.g. the EU and so-called foreign influences, such as NGOs or free, transnationally acting media or internationally oriented educational organizations, such as CEU. The CEU had to move out of Hungary and is nowadays located in Vienna, Austria, and we're very happy to have you here. We now have the rare and special chance to talk with President and Rector of CEU, Professor Dr. Michael Ignatieff, who will shed some light on what happened to the CEU and how a specific kind of communication in media and politics reinforced those developments. Before we start, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ignatieff to you, and to try to do this briefly is almost futile because your life is truly impressive. So let's start at the beginning. You were born in Canada, studied in Cambridge and received a doctorate in history from Harvard University. You started your professional life as a journalist. Then you taught at various international top universities. Your list of publications is vast. You wrote books, both non-fiction as well as novels, and published in international media such as the New York Times. You have been honored with awards all over the world, hold many honorary degrees, and you can also look back to a political career, having been the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. And before being assigned to CEU in 2016, you held the chair of press, politics and public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. And now I talked a lot. I would like to greet you very warmly. Thank you for being here with us. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure to be here, Nana.
Wonderful. So let's start with the questions. We have a lot of questions for you and we want to know everything in detail. So let's start with the CEU. The CEU is a private university founded in New York, but had its campus and educational programs in Budapest since its foundings in 1991. And in 2019, the CEU moved to Vienna. So what happened in Hungary that made moving inevitable?
Well, it became inevitable because it's really impossible for a university to function when a government is systematically hostile to it. The Orban government decided in 2016 that it faced a difficult re-election battle, and that the right way to get re-elected was to run against George Soros. Our university was founded by George Soros. He maintained a large foundation in Hungary. He'd been a pioneer in investing in Hungarian higher education and in civil society from 1991 in order to build an open society in Hungary. And Orban decided that he didn't have domestic enemies that were big enough to sustain a campaign. He needed a big imaginary enemy, a multi-billionaire Jewish, from New York, throttling the aspirations of the Hungarian people and implanting alien liberal institutions inside Hungary that were going to destabilize it. I mean, it's a whole fantastic conspiracy theory that I'm not sure he ever believed, but certainly served an electoral narrative that helped him to win election in 2018. And so they passed legislation that essentially made it illegal for us to operate in Hungary. We did not want to leave, and we sought compromise at every moment. And I spent a memorable summer in 2017 trying to get the Hungarian government and us to work to a compromise that would allow us to stay, but he didn't want to compromise. And so eventually we just decided we had to leave and go to Vienna, where the city of Vienna, the Federal Republic, the president, everybody, and his uncle and aunt gave us a very warm welcome. And so we've been very, very happy in Vienna ever since, but it has been, let me be clear, it's been brutal to be thrown out of your home. Many of our faculty are Hungarians, and many of our staff are Hungarians, and there's a tremendous sense of, frankly, being in exile, despite the fact that Vienna is a tremendously friendly place. So it's been a difficult experience, and I think it'll take us a while to get over it. And it tells you finally something very important about what's happening next door to Austria, which is that this is a single-party state consolidating itself in an ever more authoritarian direction. And one of the first places you go when you consolidate authoritarian rule is you begin to squeeze universities. So what happened to us is a warning sign right across Europe, particularly in Poland and other places where Serbia, other places where authoritarian tendencies are consolidating.
We will talk about that in detail a little bit later. First, I would like to go back to that time when you had really to move out, and you mentioned already it is actually a problem for a lot of people, students as well as staff. How did you personally experience those events, especially the political motivated communication concerning the CEU? It must have been personally also devastating somehow. How did you experience that?
Well, Nana, it was difficult. My wife is Hungarian. I mean, I have Hungarian family. I don't speak the language, but I've been coming in and out of Hungary for 25 years. So suddenly to feel you weren't welcome there was painful. And also, in terms of the political communication, the bad faith was very hard to get used to. I mean, it is a fact that CEU is the best university in Hungary in terms of international standings. There's no question about it. And we'd made, I think, a very positive contribution to Hungarian higher education. We'd attracted people back home who were working overseas. We were part of the community. We were just stunned to be suddenly the victim of this very calculated political assault. And the assault had very strongly anti-Semitic overtones. I mean, my people had to come to work for 18 months in front of election posters literally everywhere that said, "Don't let George Soros have the last laugh." Well, in the 1930s, the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi paper, used to constantly run photographs with, "Don't let the Jews have the last laugh," or "The Jews are laughing at us." So there was a faithful reprise of some extremely sinister tropes in the communication strategy of Goebbels in the 1930s that were reproduced in Hungary. Now, what was interesting about that from a communications point of view is that if you said to Viktor Orban, "These are anti-Semitic tropes with a Nazi past," he would say, "How dare you accuse me of being an anti-Semite? Some of my best friends are Jews. I keep rebuilding synagogues. This is a slander. This is an insult." So it's 21st century anti-Semitism. It's anti-Semitism that says, "How dare you accuse me of being an anti-Semite?" But there's simply no question that the undertone, the unstated premise of this stuff was disgusting. And I feel angry about it to this day. I mean, so that's what I feel: indignation, and I feel it's dangerous poison. And I can't tell you what it's like to be on the receiving end of it. You just think, Christ almighty, has nobody learned anything from the 20th century history of Hungary, where 800,000 Jews were exterminated in the space of 8 weeks in 1944? I mean, come on, this is really serious business. You go down into that well, and you're trafficking in darkness and wickedness. And so that was, I think, the part of it that made me angry. I know politics is politics, but this kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink stuff, I think is deeply sinister, and there's far too much of it in Europe, and it has to be stopped.
This is something we will also be talking about, what is happening actually in Europe, Eastern Europe, but also the rest of Europe, and how to counteract it. But to go into that direction, I would like to start from a completely different point, because you actually lectured yourself and wrote about democratic values, about the open society, academic freedom, political ethics and moral order, about governments in crisis, as well as about human rights. And I would like to ask you a question that is not quite common, but I think it's very important to get a picture of, kind of a vision or a direction where to head to. Do you have a picture of an ideally functioning state and government in mind? And how would that look like? How would a perfect political state and a system basically look like?
Yeah. Well, I'm a kind of cautious, pragmatic liberal, so my answer to that is quickly, there is no such thing. In fact, the thing about a democracy is at any given moment in any cafe in Vienna or Budapest, someone will be grumbling, and they should be grumbling. I mean, that is to say, the good thing about democracy is that at any given moment, people are discontented or unhappy or think it's failing this group or that group. And that's what I love about democracy, the constant argument, debate, the constant pressure to change. The great thing about democracies that are not silent. I've been to places, the Soviet Union in the declining years, Hungary in the 80s, places that were ruled by single-party authoritarian systems that had secret police, and the silence of these societies and the forced unanimity of these societies is precisely what you want to avoid. Equally, I think you want to avoid radical promotion of utopias in which we're all happy and we're all free. And I've never believed in that stuff. I never will. And I think the pursuit of utopia is dangerous. The pursuit of reform, the pursuit of change, the pursuit of improvement is necessary. And there's no doubt that our democracies are facing extremely serious challenges. I mean, can a democracy actually solve the climate change problem? I mean, given the veto points in a democratic system, it's much easier to do nothing than to do something. So that's a real problem. Another real problem is that the modern economy is generating new forms of inequality that leave huge numbers of people left out. Can a democracy where money is enormously powerful find the capacity to make life fairer for lots of people? These are questions I'm very interested in, and I'm not interested in utopia at all. I'm interested in responding to people being unhappy in cafes and saying we ought to do something. And that stuff, yeah, let's do it.
So you would rather go to the everyday problems or the big problems there than to see kind of seek out a vision and to see how to get there, because it's too theoretical. Let's stay practical. If you look at Europe these days, what are the biggest challenges in the European democracies? If you take a look at Eastern Europe, what is actually here burning? What are burning questions that we have to answer?
Well, I think to the degree that this is a question about European institutions, that is the European Council, the European Commission, the European Parliament, I think that it's hard to know just how much more disillusioned you could be. I mean, I think that the vaccine rollout is just a demonstration that Europe thinks of itself, Austria thinks of itself, Germany thinks of itself as tremendously competent, efficient societies with great healthcare systems, great public health systems, and hey, surprise, the British have got double the population vaccinated. The terrible Americans, those reactionary, violent, free market Americans, have actually got more people vaccinated. And Europe is sitting there telling itself how wonderfully decent and compassionate it is, and hasn't actually got the jabs in people's arms. So perhaps that's a problem. I mean, that is, there's a huge gulf between the self-regard, the self-image that Europeans have of this continent and its reality in terms of delivering competent government to its own citizens. And the vaccine problem is a problem. Now, let's not get hysterical. Over the summer, I hope, we'll all get jabs in our arms and we'll just remember this is a bad episode. But I'm afraid it confirms some difficulties. I think the other thing is that, and this takes us back to the Hungarian story and also the Polish story, there's a tremendous amount of blah, blah, blah of an empty kind from European politicians about the rule of law and defending the rule of law. And the harsh reality is that Europe has done next to nothing about the consolidation of authoritarian rule in Hungary and the steady consolidation of ever more difficult forms of rule in Poland. And so Europe walks around saying we're a union of democracies, while democracy is steadily being strangled in two very important countries in Central Europe. And when you strangle democracy in Central Europe, eventually the consequences become serious. Eventually, Russia moves into this space. Eventually, China moves into this space. And don't think I'm making this up. I mean, notice a little detail about Hungary. They threw out an American institution, my institution, that believes in open society and had an international reputation as a serious graduate school. And who has come in its place? Fudan University from China. Fudan is a university that consciously, explicitly in its charter, acknowledges the superiority of the Communist Party of China. So it's not a free institution. It may be a competent institution, it may be a university, but it's not a free institution. And this has happened right on Austria's doorstep, right on Europe's doorstep. A university that says it's a university, tells you it's a university, but it's not a free institution. So these are serious matters. In other words, two serious matters. The basic competence of European institutions is in question, and the ability of Europe to back its fine words about democracy with concrete action. So, look, people listening to me will think, oh, this is just some resentful American who does. I love Europe. I'm happy to be here. I married a European. I want to be in Europe for the rest of my life. But I'm just tired of the blah, 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 if you know what I mean. And I think a lot of Europeans are tired of blah, blah, blah.
You've been a politician yourself and you see things very clearly. What would be your suggestions? What if you were,
Having been a politician, having been a politician, I've been guilty of some blah, blah, blah myself, so, it takes one to know one is what we say in English, so.
Is there any specific tip that you would give? I mean, if you were, I don't know, in the European Commission, what would you do differently? What would you really try to aim, for example, to save the rule of law in those endangered countries or to secure democratic principles? Do you have any ideas?
Well, let's admit it's very difficult. Each member state has effective veto power, and so there's a built-in systematic contradiction. You give these speeches, but you don't have the levers to enforce it. And the means of enforcement are, it seems to me, very clear. You get Western states pick up the phone and say, our taxpayers are providing the money that some of these governments basically steal. And this is just insupportable to us as political leaders. We're accountable to our taxpayers, and you guys are stealing it. And the very viability of us as a commercial union is threatened by the fact that the rule of law is just fragmenting here in Europe. You can't have a single market without the rule of law. So if you don't stop evicting universities and stop enriching yourself in this way, you won't get structural subsidies from the European funds. I mean, it's just it's not complicated what you have to do. The problem is that then Poland and Hungary then say, well, we're going to walk away. We're going to leave Europe. Fine, be my guest. But I mean, you know, this is not going to happen. This is not going to happen because the European Union is like a bicycle. Everybody feels we've just got to keep pedaling or we'll all fall off. But the problem is not what would you do about it. I think everybody knows what you could do about it. The reality is that the system itself imposes such obstacles to any action that the Union keeps staggering on from one crisis to another.
You just mentioned also systemic problems. So if you think about, the EU being, could it be built in a better way? The Canadian system, the American system. Should there be a different kind of power balance between the European Parliament and the Commission and all the heads of states, or should it be completely built new? Because, there is the future of Europe discussion now going on, so I go into that direction with you right now. Would you build it differently?
It's a tough one, Nana, because it's a union of sovereign states, and these are states that in many cases are hundreds and hundreds of years old. Some of them are 1,000 years old. Some of them have been national communities for a very, very long time, with different languages, different cultures and traditions. And part of what one loves about Europe is, in fact, that variegation, that plurality of worldviews and traditions and histories. And Hungary is a particularly good example of that. It's a language that no one else can speak, but it's a glorious language and much loved by its people. And the language has contributed great art and literature to the world and fantastic music. So you don't want to have a Europe which reduces the specificity of national cultures. And what is clear in the pandemic is that the pandemic has reinforced and strengthened national sovereignty, not weakened it. Because at the last resort, every government has had reserved to itself the right to close its borders. So getting beyond a club of sovereign states towards a more federal Europe, at least in the limited sense of having a common budget, having transfers from north to south, having a sharing of burdens, and having the capacity to take action quickly to defend vital interests like the pandemic, does require some strengthening of the central institutions at the expense of the sovereigns. And at the moment, I just don't see any likelihood that any of the nation states involved will do that. So Europe will stagger on. But there are things that are forcing change from the outside. One of them is the rise of China, and one of them is the return of the United States. And with this huge market, that 500 million, a very high standard of living, Europe senses that it has the power to define itself in relation to China on the one hand and the United States on the other, and use its economic power as a lever to maintain the national independence of all the sovereigns. So Europe will not disintegrate because each sovereign knows on its own Denmark will be too weak to survive, Hungary, Austria, they need each other. And that will slowly, organically, I think, but not in my lifetime, increase the capacity of Europe to act as one unit. But don't hold your breath would be my view of it.
So it's about a process, and it will take simply longer than anyone might hope for, but it's still progressing, so that the direction will be followed. So there's some hope in your words, and I take that very sincerely. Thank you very much for that. Let's come back to communication, communicators and politicians, and also the tough challenges we face here as democracies and as Europe. You have a background as a politician, as we said. You have been seeing politicians acting in a positive perhaps style, but also in negative styles concerning political decision-making or communication styles during the pandemic. Do you have any examples of, best cases and worst cases that we can grasp a little bit, what is really actually positive leadership and what is should be avoided and should not be voted, to be honest?
I have a couple of positive examples. I think everybody's looking at Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand and congratulating her for her frankness and decisiveness. Now, it's an island in the South Pacific, so some of the pressures that Austria or Hungary or Germany faces are very different. She really can shut the place down. But even so, I think everybody thinks she's been an example of firm, clear leadership. One of the most impressive speeches during the first wave was Angela Merkel's speech to the nation in March or April. I just thought I couldn't improve that as communications. I just thought she was wonderful. A third example, which CEU gives out an Open Society Prize every year, we're giving it this year to the Minister of Public Health in the state of Kerala in southern India. Shalaya Teacher is her name, and she's a woman in her 60s who's, I think, trained as a physicist, and she runs this public health system in a very poor country, but she is using advanced data techniques. If you go onto the Kerala website, you'll see it. They have the best public website in terms of what's happening with the disease that I've seen anywhere. She has a great public health network that has been built up for generations, and built up by whom, I should add, by the Communist Party of India. I mean, I'm no communist myself. I'm not from that family at all, but this is a state that has invested in public health, and so she runs a good machine. And she's been very firm and very clear, and her communications have been excellent. So it's perhaps no accident that three examples I've given you are all by women.
Wonderful. Perhaps one example I would like to examine a little bit closer. You mentioned Angela Merkel and her first speech during the first wave, let's say like that. What was it specifically that you kind of found positive, or that spoke to you, or that you said yourself, oh, I couldn't have done this better, because let's learn from your expertise and from your through your eyes.
Well, I thought it was short. It was very anti-rhetorical. The thing that's good about Angela Merkel is there's no fine words. I mean, it's all just, I'm speaking to you as your neighbor. I'm speaking to you as your chancellor. The mutti aspect of it is kind of very effective. You just say, okay, Angie, talk to me. I mean, there's no kind of, I'm talking down at you. She never talks down at you. She seems to be talking at you, close to you. Her mastery of the detail is very, you have a sense that before she gave the speech, she wasn't handed the speech by some young 25-year-old who said, Angie, just read the damn thing. She's spent hours, days mastering the data, getting a basic understanding of the biology, the epidemiology of the disease. You have a sense that she knows what she's talking about. People praise her scientific background. I don't know. I think she's just very thorough, and the thoroughness comes through in the delivery. A lot of the communications mistakes that politicians make are that they don't really think they need to master the detail. That's for their subordinates, and they can just be given the speech, and then what they are simply performers. Angie's not a terrific performer. I don't think she's ever given a great speech where you thought, oh God, she's fantastic. What I like about it is it's just, I know my stuff. You've elected me to know my stuff. Here's what you need to know. And she doesn't sugarcoat the pill a lot of the time. She was the first politician to say in Europe, or perhaps in the world, 70 to 80% of our population is going to be infected. And she said this in February and March, taking one look at what was happening in Italy, in Bergamo and these places. And she said, this is going to be really bad. And I think that kind of candor has been very important, because that the problem with political communication is that there isn't a politician alive who doesn't want to give people good news. And sometimes the news is just, excuse my language, shitty. I mean, it's just terrible. And the news about the COVID has been terrible. And the recurrent mistake that politicians have made is say, cheer up, there's hope around the corner. Well, it just, it is actually better to say, look, I don't know how long this is going to go on, and it's going to be tough all the way through. And here's the best guess we have as what you need to do. But I think the political communication that has been very unsuccessful has been the stuff that, let's lighten it up and then we tamp it down, let's lighten it up, tamp it down, because you keep wanting to be the bearer of good news. And I think sometimes, paradoxically, the right strategy for a politician is to be the bearer of bad news. Just, it isn't great, guys. I mean, it's going to be bad for quite a while, and don't ask me when it's going to be over, because I don't know. And that presents a really difficult challenge for politicians. And I've been in the chair in politics, and I don't know whether I could have followed my own advice, but I do think that's what you have to do in these situations.
It seems to me it all boils down to credibility, to be, reliable, to have a factual insight that is reliable, but also an emotional, caring component that is true, that is honest. Wonderful. In this difficult climate of political communication between, building up hopes and then giving hard lockdowns, or having a steady I don't know communication, which is as difficult as well. How important are independent media and educational institutions nowadays to, build up a civic body to be able to carry such difficult, happenings and the uncertainty in society?
Very important. A good example of that is the Johns Hopkins University website on the global incidents. For a long period, it was the central collecting site for all the data that everybody used. So that was a wonderful example of a university leading and saying, look, we're not a political organization. We don't take dictation from politicians. We just collect the data. And that's something I think universities, when they're really good, can play a very important role. I think that there have been a lot of civil society organizations, public health groups that have been extremely useful in spreading information. I mean, we need to take heart or be encouraged by the fact that this thing hits us in late January 2020. By November, December, we have a vaccine. By February or March, we're getting the vaccine in people's arms. And the speed with which this is developed is a function of a digital and internet-connected age. It's clear that the Chinese scientists sequenced the genome of this virus very early. That was then shared internationally. By early February, the Germans, the British, the Americans are beginning to think, okay, there are only 5 or 6 basic options here, and they are explored very quickly. And I think the digital age made the response times unbelievably more rapid than they were during the Spanish flu of 1918-20. And I think that saved a lot of lives. The downside on the communication thing is that the digital media empowers a lot of disinformation, at the limit anti-vaccination views. And this is where you have to handle it carefully. I mean, it's entirely appropriate for there to be a vigorous internet-wide debate about the incidence of blood clots in the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's entirely right, and in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Everybody should weigh in, but we shouldn't listen to everybody. I mean, there are a few doctors who actually know or have a good idea why this vaccine may be generating blood clots. And then what I'm also noticing in the media is that people are saying, if you take the birth control pill, you risk blood clots. if you get COVID, you risk blood clots. So let's understand risk. So there's a huge internet-wide discussion of risk, which is extremely important and part of a vigorous democratic society. And of course, there's a lot of garbage in there, people talking nonsense, but people are always talking nonsense in this world. I talk nonsense some of the time. Nana, you may talk nonsense occasionally, and it all gets out in the media. And so we have to be more vigilant, more careful, and discriminating who we listen to. But by and large, democratic societies, I think, have been really good about this huge public debate about risk. And I think and the fact that there's been so much compliance to lockdown is a sign that people, despite the disinformation, despite the anti-vaxxers, despite the protests, people basically have got the message. They have reasoned about this and thought, okay, there is evidence here that if I stay home and keep my kids home and do all this painful stuff, less people will die. That appears to be a fact. Well, that sustains the entire strategy. If people didn't believe that, the death count would be much, much higher. So if you stand back from this, I think that the communications of a democratic society has proved its worth, its resilience, its robustness in this crisis.
So despite the sometimes a little bit too loud spikes of negativity or of doubts, you encourage the discussion because it's actually a learning process. We all get to learn about, human bodies and society and also the role of communication. So this is, it's worthwhile, the big discussion. I think it's also very important to understand that this also is a process. Like Europe, the European development might be a process, takes long, but we all learn on the way. Taking a look at where the open discussion is not so valued in those countries such as Hungary, when we take a look at, the freedom of the speech or the variety of media is, cut down. How would you assess the situation in these countries nowadays when it comes to the freedom of speech, when it comes to this open exchange to build an opinion by yourself?
Right. Well, the COVID thing allows you to see what price a society plays for authoritarianism. I'll start not with Hungary, but with Russia. It is clear that more people have died of COVID than the regime is reporting. Consequence, nobody trusts the numbers. Consequence, nobody trusts what the authorities are saying. Consequence, the trust that is absolutely vital to sustain a public health response to is not present in Russia, despite the fact that they've got some fantastic doctors, courageous nurses, wonderful vaccine. I mean, the Sputnik is a good product. I mean, whatever. You go to Hungary, and a rather similar phenomenon is in play. But there's another phenomenon in play that I need to mention, which is the partisan divides over whether people believe the numbers. Supporters of Viktor Orban believe his numbers. Opponents of Orban do not believe his numbers. In the United States, I think very alarmingly, something like 40% of Republican voters, people who voted for Mr. Trump last time, are not going to take the vaccine because their partisan political allegiance leads them to believe that they're not being told the truth by these liberal organizations that are trying to tell them to put masks on and roll up their sleeves. Now, when partisan bias begins to cut across a public information campaign on the virus, that's a very serious matter. And it's not, in other words, I'm saying the problem about trust in information is not just confined to authoritarian societies like Hungary, where basically lots of people simply don't believe the story they're being told by the government. It's also, unfortunately, the case in one of the freest media environments in the world, the United States, and the partisan blinkers that are on people here is a little worrying because, I wouldn't vote Republican, but I sure don't want anybody to die just because they have some political view that makes it impossible for them to roll up their arms. I mean, they roll up their sleeves and get a shot.
Let's talk a little bit about the dividing of society, because that's where we are right now. And it seems sometimes that the divided society really has a ever-growing group of people who kind of don't care about basic values such as, freedom and equality and rule of law, democracy. What do these people want? What is your experience? Do they really want one authoritarian leader to tell them how to live, or do they want a quick answer like, build a wall and all our problems are gone? Is it really that easy, or is there something else behind that?
I think there's terrific polarization, and I think there's polarization in Austrian society where we're doing this interview. It's very long-standing, by the way. I mean, their political families here in Austria, which are very deeply rooted, but it's an interesting example because despite the fact that they're very starkly different political families and polarization in Austria, there still is, as far as I understand it, a common space of shared beliefs about the facts. Whatever, despite the political family you're in, most people believe that the COVID situation in Vienna justifies a continued lockdown, right? That's right. It's not partisan division gone that far. But in other places, it appears to be the case that some of the partisan division has created alternative fact worlds. Simply people believe things that whole clusters of other people simply don't believe to be true. And that's worrying everybody because you can't run a democracy if we don't share some common point of view. I think one of the things that we need to get a grip about is that I think it has always been the case, that political partisanship, religious affiliation, class affiliation, gender have always affected our construction of reality. It's always been the case. But there's something that we don't understand about digital media that has instead of producing commonality, produced increasing fracture. And some of it has to be pushed back against. I mean, it is extraordinary to me, just to take an example at random, that people would seriously say that the only person who can translate a black poet, the wonderful young woman who read at Mr. Biden's inauguration, that the only people who can translate that poetry in another language have to be of her race. It's just, you think, how did we get here? How did we get here? How did we get from a world in which, some of the great translators of European literature from one language to the other were men or women or whatever, and nobody checked their race or their class or their gender when they translated Tolstoy into Spanish. I mean, this stuff is very pernicious and has to be pushed back on because it's part of a view of the world that just has to be wrong, which is that that we live in different mental and fact-based worlds on the basis of gender, race, class, and sexual orientation. It just can't be the case. You're a woman, I'm a man, we live in the same universe. There's no question that women see certain issues very differently, as I've had to learn all my life. And there's some moments when women have to discover that men just see things very differently. But we are still in the same damn world together. I mean, and some of that has been fragmented in the last 20, 30 years in ways that is stunning, surprising, disappointing. And somehow the technology has made it worse, not better.
When we talk about the common basics you just mentioned before, between the parties in Austria, but actually we can talk about the common basics in a Western society, let's say it like that, being, despite all the differences in the society, there are basics being like rule of law, like the democratic principles, things like that, secularity. These basics, this is what I would like to talk about. As long as we are all different and we can see each other in being different, but we still stick to those basics, we can seemingly have a peaceful living together. But once these basics are, attacked, and those dividing parts seem to attack them because they are politically motivated from other systems than democratic systems, we have to do something about that as democratic system. So there is a quote you might know from Sir Karl Popper. He says, don't tolerate intolerance. It's simply, ruining the tolerant system. So what would you say how to deal with fake news, disinformation, manipulation, political manipulation? You mentioned the digital world being, highly effective in that area. Are you having any ideas how to strengthen democracy by limiting intolerant actions?
Boy, I mean, one thing I know clearly is that it makes what universities do more important than ever. Our business is to turn out graduates who know two things. One, that reality is very complicated and we disagree about what it means. But secondly, we have tools in which we can get to a common view of what the world looks like. And we do that every day. And CEU and all the universities, the good ones in the world, are seriously devoted to that task. And it's the most important thing we do, and it's the most important contribution we make to society, because we're constantly injecting new knowledge into the bloodstream of our fellow citizens in ways that I think is helpful to consolidating a common shared ground. But let's be aware that, the percentage of citizens, even in Europe, who have access to university education is not what it should be. So we need to find ways to reach out, not necessarily through university training, but just education really is the only reliable antidote to this stuff. And so that's where I would go. And then universities have to be very careful not to be purveying, fashionable nonsense. And because there is a lot of fashionable nonsense that comes out of universities that says you can only understand the black experience if you're black. You can only understand the Jewish experience if you're Jewish. You can only understand the female experience if you're a female. And this is pernicious nonsense. That is, it's partly true. There is something absolutely specific about the black experience that only someone who has black skin can fully appreciate. And that must always be respected. But equally, we live in the same world. It just, and we're 99.4% the same genetic makeup, and that's our fate, and we have to live it together. And that's a crucial democratic principle that I just feel needs more and more emphasis. Rich, poor, black, white, urban, rural, educated, less educated, fully abled, disabled, every category of difference pales before our common human reality. And you can't run any democracy unless you start from that core premise, that there's just so much more that we share than that divides us. And there'd be no point having politics if that wasn't true. It'd just be war. And it isn't war because we recognize in our differences certain common things that we share and value and love and treasure and want to preserve. So that's what that's what we have to do. But it's work of every day. It's not just universities or education people. It's just,
We're We're all different and we're all human, and every one of us can display that in the everyday experience with each other. Yes, of course. The power of empathy also might be important in that context. I would like to take a closer look at the role of the CEU in democratic and civic education, because this most probably is a big issue for you also after the experiences that you had with, being coming from Hungary to Austria. Are there any specific educational programs of the CEU addressing topics like democracy, rule of law, human rights? Is there a specific program running?
We have a huge list of, we have a democracy institute based in Budapest. We have courses on democratic theory, the sociology of democracy, the social psychology of democracy. We've got a lot of stuff out there. Some of it's very academic, however, and some of it doesn't really communicate terribly well out to the wider world. But again, universities aren't legitimized or defined solely by their capacity to serve their societies. A lot of these obscure democratic bits of research that we do are designed for narrow audiences. We're a very, kind of research-intensive academic institution, so some people look at what we do and kind of scratch their heads. What's the relevance of that to the wider world? But I think one thing one looks at, one notices over time is just, Keynes said somewhere, and I'm going to get this wrong, John Maynard Keynes said, that the world really is shaped and changed by people with crazy ideas up in a garret, and it's slightly the same thing by analogy with the university. Some of the most abstruse and abstract, non-popular ideas start in some obscure journal, in an academic journal, and then end up changing the world. And so, that's what we do. And a university president has to defend precisely our uselessness, right? The fact that we're not very helpful. We're always talking this obscure language. I mean, there's a reason for it, which is sometimes out of all that process of obscurity come clear and useful ideas that help people.
What would you wish for the future of the CEU if you had, a lot of wishes free?
I want it to I want it to be permanently discontented with itself and trying to improve itself at every time. I mean, the pathos of institutions is that they get turned in upon themselves. They become complacent. They become self-satisfied. We've got reasons to be proud of ourselves after 30 years, but my vision of a university is it's in a state of permanent experimentation and change, permanently trying stuff out with students, discovering it doesn't work, permanently being forced to change. One of the greatest forces of change at a university that people don't notice, but which is the key dynamic, is that every year we get another class of 18-year-olds. Every year we get another class of 24. And this constant encounter with the next generation is the basic driver that forces us to change. In the literal sense that a teacher like me, I'm going to go back into the classroom after I step down as rector. I'm going to go into a classroom and I'm going to try the stuff I love to teach. And I may well discover that the kids, the 18-year-olds are saying, what is this guy talking about? Why do I want to learn that? And then I'll have to change. And out of that process, universities are forced to constantly innovate. And that's a wonderful thing about them. And that's why I'm very attached to their function and purpose in our societies.
Might this recipe, the rejuvenation of a system, through generational exchange, might this also be a recipe for Hungary to get out of, the authoritarian direction it's now still moving in?
I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that, because there are people who are coming up to being, voting age, who've never known anything other than Viktor Orban. And just as there are lots of people in Russia coming up to voting age who've never known anything other than Vladimir Putin, and there are billions of people who've never known anything other than Xi Jinping. And ditto Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, I could go around the block here. I think generational change is the thing they most fear. And I think generational change is the greatest danger to these regimes. Because at a certain point, kids think, why can't I be freer than this? Why can't things be different? And eventually that produces these shocking uprisings like Tiananmen Square, like Gezi Park in Istanbul, like the demonstrations that were mounted in support of us in Hungary, and they were all led by the next generation. So yes, I'm very hopeful long term, because the great weakness of authoritarian regimes is that they don't have a succession plan. Ask yourself what comes after Putin. No one has any idea. And that is an actively long-term destabilizing force for the regime itself. It doesn't know what comes next. And that then produces enormous internal battles over the succession, because biology dictates that Mr. Putin is not immortal, and eventually he'll have to be replaced. Xi Jinping is the same story, Erdogan is the same story, and Orban is the same story. Biology solves these problems eventually, but at enormous, horrendous cost. So the one good thing about democracy, and everybody's disillusioned about democracy, is it does have an answer to that question. You throw the rascals out and you get some new rascals in and see whether they're any better. And occasionally you get someone who you elect as a rascal, and she turns out to be a leader of courage and distinction. And that's why you want to bet on democracy long term, because it has an answer to the succession problem. And it has a much better answer to the young generation than autocracy. Because autocracy wants to lock things in silent control to one generation. No. The great thing about democracy is it's always having to serve up new leadership for new generations. And so that's why it's not merely sentimental to bet on democracy, it's actually a smart bet.
As long as there are alternatives, we have choices, and we still have hope that things can get different in a quicker time than when, after an autocracy falls apart, there might be a phase of chaos because there are no alternatives and nothing to really stabilize the system. So let's see what's happening here. Our hopes are high. Last questions. What are your wishes and hopes for the future of the development of Europe? Is there anything you would wish for all of us as you are living here right now?
I do hope we get back to a borderless Europe. I mean, the borders have come back big time. But I hope it's a borderless Europe that's smart enough to welcome lots of strangers, people of different races and colors, a Europe that's open, never closed, and a Europe that's always innovating. I think the fear in Europe is that you become a kind of museum culture. It becomes a lovely place to have a nice glass of wine and sit on a terrace, but nothing's happening. You want a Europe that's constantly innovating, constantly inventing new things. You don't want to have a world in which all the technological dynamism is in China or in San Francisco. You want to have real dynamism, real innovation, new art, new culture, new music, new inventions, new processes, new ideas in Europe itself. So kind of a Europe that's constantly renewing itself with this generational change, a Europe that is open, and a Europe that is less afraid. When you stand back from the globe and you ask yourself, where would you like to be? Where would you like to live? on the globe, it's hard to beat Europe as a destination. And we need to remember that and feel a kind of, this is terrific. And so let's live it without fear, without closing down, without thinking our job is to protect ourselves from something. Let's, open up and embrace the world, because we're in a very good place. So there we are, Nana.
Thank you so much for these wonderful words of wisdom, and for your precious insights and your time. I wish you all the best, and also for CEU, of course. And thank you.
Thank you.
Europa, gefühlsecht. Die vierte Macht.